Thank you very much for having me, and I'm excited to talk about this. And you all get a big thanks for being my guinea pigs. This is the first time this information has left my head in a lecture form and turned into an actual lecture. So could get interesting. All right. And I'm going to start a little story. I think about 8 years ago, I was working on a project as a graduate student on the history of the Arkansas Education Association. And I just came across this reference to the Union School, or it was a school founded by the Quakers that Charlotte Stevens, whom a lot of people around Little Rock know. She was the first black educator in Little Rock, and it just mentioned, she went to the Union School, and that there were some Quaker missionaries. And I guess about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, during an education event here at the museum, we were having our Civil War days, and I just vaguely remember this reference. And with our former education director, I'm like, weren't missionaries running around Arkansas working on educating the newly freed slaves? And he's like, I think I remember something about that. So this actually started as the basis for a character, and it's turned into a little bit more research. Now, the Union School did in fact exist, and it was run by Quakers, but out of respect to the Quakers, I'm going to refer to them now as Friends. In general, the Friends prefer that name. It's the name they've been called since founding, and Quakers, even though that's what you would think of in general, and most Americans recognize the term, it started as a derogatory term, and since the Friends have actually claimed it back, and it's probably lost the derogatory connotations. So this story of the Union School, not only does it start here, there's the part where it comes together in the Union School in Little Rock, but there's a couple different avenues coming into things. It's a little bit about the initial efforts for public education for black people in Arkansas. It's just about the general history and the presence of the Society of Friends in North America. And then Charlotte Stevens also gets a little bit into it. So it's neat to see all these things coming together in a time when this whole country is absolutely torn by war. So that's very... But I'm going to say the story actually starts, and let me go ahead and get my PowerPoint caught up.
The blue arrow underneath you.
My graphic right here is essentially what I just said. So I'm going to pull up this thing. To understand the Society of Friends, I think you really need to go back to their beginnings, and there's a couple ideals that when George Fox, their founder, starts this movement in the 1640s, these ideals, you'll still see them played out in modern times, and these are ideals that are very specific to the missionary work that is being done in Arkansas and during the time of the Civil War. And I also want to point out this work, it's not happening in just Arkansas. With this specific group that I've been studying, which is the Indiana Yearly Meeting of Quakers, they also have missionaries in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Mississippi at this time. But some things you need to remember about the Friends from their beginnings in the 1640s with George Fox is the Friends are relatively, at that point I'm going to call them a radical movement, or within English society and the understanding of Protestant Christianity in general. They're pretty radical. They believe in things like spiritual equality among men and women from the very founding. That's one of their ideas, which I'm not going to say that in 1640 or even 1650 or even later on that members of the Friends would necessarily say men and women, they're equal standing in society. You still will have this doctrine, well, yes, men are the household, but when it's between a person and God, men and equal are on equal spiritual footing. So that's an incredibly radical idea, and in my understanding of the development of just the history of Christianity in general, that's the first time somebody says that. It's coming from George Fox. Another important point into understanding the Quakers or the Friends is their emphasis on education. Granted, the education, it's still coming from that religious point that everyone needs to read, and it's that everybody needs to be able to read the Bible because every person has the ability to interpret and understand and to use the Friends' languages to follow the inner light of Christ for themselves. and education becomes the tool to do that. And again, that education, it doesn't go, well, we're only educating our boys. It's we educate men and we educate women. At this early history, and even in the Indiana Yearly Meeting in the 1860s when I'm talking about it, this education that's happening, you may have mixed classrooms, but there's a good chance that boys and girls are being educated separately. However, there is no difference in the curriculum. They are learning these same things like your reading, your writing, your arithmetic, real basically. You even see reports from the 1860s and already established schools within the, not missionary schools, but established schools within Indiana where they're even teaching things like trigonometry and astronomy and chemistry. So it's getting into rather advanced subjects, and still that no differentiation. Boys learn this, girls learn this. It's everybody has that education. And the pacifism is another huge component of the Friends' beliefs, and that also will follow into this story along with the education. And then, this is a quirk, because from the first time I ever heard about Friends, I was probably in 5th grade and learning American history, and you learn about like Sojourner Truth or Frederick Douglass and these people, and you start hearing about abolition, and depending where you are, they might throw in, oh yes, the Friends were abolitionists, or they were groups of people. One thing to remember is Friends have not always been abolitionists. The founder in England in 1640, George Fox even says, pagans who had no knowledge of the historical Jesus could still experience the inward light of Christ, and if obedient to it, could be saved without ever having heard the Christian preaching or knowledge of the Bible. So there's a strong foundation that every person, including pagans, so it doesn't apply that they all have this ability to follow that, which from the beginning there is within the Friends denomination, there's this question of, is slavery all right? Because when you hold a person in bondage, you do not allow them to follow the inner light of Christ according to George Fox's philosophies. And at the same time, the slaveholder, they're not following their inner light of Christ because they're holding another person in bondage and not allowing them to. So concepts like free choice and things get very in. So what you need to, this is still in England. By the 1670s, there's definitely a presence of Friends in North America. So you have that, and it continues to grow throughout the 17th and into the 18th century. And in the 18th century, you start to really see some changes. Early Society of Friends are absolute radicals in England. In one sense, England chases them out, and they are a threat to the structure of the society. So they set up over here. Some colonies tolerated Friends very well, like we always hear of William Penn in Pennsylvania. Maryland was another place that was much more tolerant of them, but Massachusetts was like, get out of here. We do not want you. You're causing trouble. You're stirring things up. So in that time, from the 1720s to 1750s over here, the population of Friends, it grows. They're never a huge denomination. Maybe by 1800, there might be about 100,000 of them. So they're noticeable, but they're not a huge population. And one of the things you see is, at this point, even into the 1750s, this denomination is just about 100 years old, and people are figuring this out. And so you can, reading your literature, you see the Friends really growing and figuring out how they fit in. In the 1750s, and even up into the Revolutionary War, the Friends, for the most part, a lot of them tend to own lots of land. They have mansions, they have plantations, and they have slaves. And when I say plantations, I don't necessarily just mean a cotton plantation. I mean just large-scale farming in a place like Pennsylvania, because that's one thing we forget. At one point in New England and the North, there were also slaves there. It just ends much sooner than it does in this part of the country. So you see a lot of Friends with a lot of material goods and wealth, but through that movement in the society, you also start to see a lot of questioning with Friends, and they're going, are we supposed to have this stuff? Is this in line with our beliefs? You know, we talk about education. And so through the Revolutionary War and going towards 1800, you see this movement to separate a little bit from society, to trim back on your material things. And most importantly, 1750 within America, there becomes a very distinct movement within the Friends to say slavery is abolished, or to abolish slavery and move away from the secularism. And it keeps going. And even by the 1770 in New England, Friends have decided if you want to remain a member of the Friends, you need to give up your slaves. So this is a good point, and this also gets in by the 1770s and the Revolutionary War and the founding of this country. The Friends are one of the better documented entities providing humanitarian services. So yes, all the humanitarian inclination, it's coming from their religion, but they're also a group of people who do have, especially on the Western frontier, so when I'm talking in 1770, 1780 about the Western frontier, think Western Pennsylvania and moving into Ohio and even Indiana, and these people tend to have good relations with the Native Americans and are doing things like providing an education and teaching them to read. So even 60 years later, or by the time you get to the Civil War, if you think about it, it's not that big of a jump that these are the same people being the champions of the newly freed men to provide them with resources and help these people, give them access to education and things. So you have that connection that's already there. I was going to say, by the 1780s, the Society of Friends in America definitely accepts black members. So that's fairly early on. And then in 1784, you have that significance of the American Friends overall say you must make arrangements to free your slaves if you want to remain within the society. So compared to other groups, the Friends get to that abolitionist stance relatively early. And also in that by the 1780s and 90s, through the Revolutionary War and that early part of the history, you still have Friends that are in a lot of high positions of power, and it's not until after 1800 you see in things like the Senate and the House and the government, it's the first time you see the people who have those positions, it's not dominated by the Friends, and you see this change out of the people who are members of the Friends. They're removing themselves purposefully and intentfully from secularism, and those who remain within the denomination make an effort to separate themselves, whether it be by plain clothes or even, as in the case of the yearly Indiana meeting, is moving west. So that's about where I'm going to stop. I'm just going to my basic history of understanding where the Friends come. So the Friends, and I will be talking about the Indiana yearly meeting mostly because this is the specific group that was in Arkansas doing work. And now we're going to take a jump of about 60 years to look what's going on from about 1800 to 1860. I'll explain this graphic in a moment. But right here, now it's too sensitive. All right, this blue dot right here, that's Richmond, Indiana, and that's going to be the central headquarters of the Indiana yearly meeting. And so I can explain my research process a little bit in this, I have gleaned a lot of my information from about the years from 1860 to 1867. I was able to find the actual yearly meeting minutes digitized online, and it has been fantastic. It's made my life really easy to go through these. So I do have a lot of quotes, but they're coming directly from the meeting minutes. And just to kind of give you an idea to catch the flavor and the concerns of the Indiana yearly meeting in 1860, to quote their meeting minutes, it just says, "We desire to encourage all our members who may engage in the responsible duty of teaching the youth, whether in our own society or beyond our borders, not to shrink from any service, which a watchful and prayerful regard to duty may point out to them, but to embrace every right opening which their calling affords to inoculate sound moral and religious as well as literary instruction." And I think in 1860 that captures the spirit of the Friends very well, because it's this education. And on 1860, I'm sure, and this when this meeting is occurring, it's in the late fall of the year. So if you think September, October is when these meetings are occurring. So you know that the U.S. in 1860, it's in turmoil, but the Friends are more concerned with education is what they are. And as I point out, that education, it's not just secular matters. It's still that it comes from this religious background. So that's what's going on in 1860. And by 1861, when the meeting occurs again, we'll start the last weekend of September and go into October. The focus of the yearly meeting isn't education is still a major concern, but all of a sudden that call to pacifism is coming up again. So, and just some of the meeting minutes. It says, if we are careful to calculate the principle of peace on earth and goodwill to men on our own children, as well as on those with whom we are associated and endeavor to instill particularly into the minds of the young the ground upon which our testimony against war is founded, it would have a salutary influence in preventing our young friends from engaging in military service and being carried by an exciting cause into a position which would lead them into a violation of the commands of our Lord to love our enemies, and bringing them unto that love for our fellow men, which would rather lead us to lay down our own lives than to take those of our fellow being. Unless we are prepared to suffer wrong and take it patiently, to abstain from evil speaking, from all retaliation, and from the spirit of evil, we cannot bear a consistent testimony against war. All our professions of doing so are in vain if we are at enmity with our brother. If we would be found consistent in the Christian duty of simplicity and self-denial, it must spring from true conversation and from that work of the Holy Spirit in the heart, which would lead us to leave off all the mere outward adoring and everything which indicates the pride of the heart. So you can see that in 1860, there's still that concern for and that humanitarian, or I get a lot of that humanitarian streak is very strongly there, but the yearly meeting is still more concerned with its members. We are pacifist. We believe this. The war needs to stop from the beginning. And it goes on in these notes to just say, we notice with regret that so many of our youth are entirely dependent for their school education on those who are not in membership with us, being fully persuaded that nothing has a greater tendency, especially in this period of great national commotion, to imbue their minds with the spirit that will lead them from us and out of such a course of life that is consistent with our Christian profession. We desire that no diminution of our outward prosperity may be allowed to restrain us from the earnest and liberal efforts to make the important work of education among us guarded from the many hurtful influences by which we are peculiarly surrounded. Keep pace with the pressing necessities which now urge us to increase our zeal in this duty. So again, you're seeing that. But in 1861, is also the first time I noticed that in their yearly meetings, there are some committees making reports on the condition of colored people. As far as I can tell, in the 1861, these reports are only within just the geographical boundaries of what we'd call Indiana and a little bit further west into Illinois and things. And so it is brought up in 1861, and this is from the committee that's just talking about the committee's actual name is the Committee on the Condition of Colored People. And again, it's that education's coming up and says, several schools are reported as having been taught amongst them in different settlements. Where their numbers have not been sufficient to make schools of their own, they have participated in friend schools. And in a few cases, they have been admitted in the school districts in common with white children. They are said to have had made satisfactory improvement in their studies. It is gratifying to be able to say that their general improvement in literature has enabled them to furnish teachers of their own color in most of their schools, some of whom are well qualified to teach the common branches of an English education and a few higher branches. So in 1861 is also the first time in this specific meeting that you see the education. They're not just worried about the Quaker children or the children of the Friends, but maybe even some of their neighbors' children. You also see a specific point delineating, we are worried about, these would be free blacks at this point. We are worried about free children of color in our region. So, you get that. And of something to note, in reports previous to 1861, the Indiana Yearly Meeting had a mission to the Shawnee Indians, and all of a sudden I see those reports are not coming as frequently, so what I'm thinking is happening is that there's a transition within this group, and they don't give up on the Shawnee missions entirely, but they're focusing their efforts much more on educating black children as opposed to having their missions into the Shawnee. So that's coming from September of 1861. By 1862, you definitely see the Civil War is continuing to have an effect on the yearly meetings, and within that, there is no necessarily call to action to educate these newly free slaves. The slaves have not necessarily been freed yet for education, but there's still that ardent call for pacifism and a reminder to the youth of the Friends to, we are pacifists, we do not take part in it, and it's their holy calling. But one thing I caught of note in 1862 is you see more reporting on just the education of black children within that specific area of Indiana. And the recommendation that money is also raised for these funds to further their efforts. All right. And then 1863 is really the big year that the groundwork gets going and things start to happen. And this is also what I can find the documentary evidence coming from the Indiana Yearly Meeting is when this group spreads out beyond just their geographical confines and they start heading down the Mississippi River. So the blue dots, there's one for Little Rock, there's one for Pine Bluff, Helena, and Memphis. I kind of use the same dot to represent those. One for Jackson and one for Vicksburg. And those are known locations that are all listed in these notes of where this group of Friends has schools or orphan asylums, or they're doing some kind of work. And there's a lot of things that stick out about the 1863 report on the condition of colored people. And I believe this is also the year that the name of the committee changes from the Commission on Colored People to the Commission on Freedmen. So I actually think that's a very neat change in language to go with that. And the first segment from the 1863 report that I think is worth noting, and this is still from within their geographical boundaries of about the state of Indiana, it says, reports were received from nearly all branch committees presenting a summary of their proceedings the past year, by which it appears they have continued their labors for promotion of schools, education, and the general improvement of colored people in their respective neighborhoods. So you have that going on. At the same time, I found this report rather interesting. It says, in the second month last, the committee was informed that a free colored man by the name of Alfred Buck was in prison in Memphis, Tennessee, on suspicion of being a slave, which claimed the attention of the committee. And Friends of Cincinnati on this committee were directed to extend the necessary care in obtaining his release. They wrote to an attorney living at Memphis to attend the ease. He informed them that there was no chance of obtaining his release without some to identify him, whereupon one of their number delegated to go to Memphis for that purpose. On reaching there, he found Alfred Buck had escaped from custody. The expense accruing was $40, which the said committee paid. Information is now received that he has since arrived at Cincinnati. So all of a sudden you see this trend from, okay, we're only worried about what's going on in Indiana, and here's a message coming from their friends from another group in Cincinnati saying, well, we're trying to get this guy in Memphis out of jail. So you see that. And then to follow that, within a few paragraphs that says nearly all reports mention some deficiency in regard to our Christian testimony against bearing arms and all military services. Parents are advised to watch over their children and see that their minds are not filled with false views of military glory and achievement. We believe it right to revive at the time the following advice given to our members many years ago and earnestly urge upon all friends, younger and older, firmly to maintain our Christian views upon the subject. So you're still seeing that pacifism mixed in. You're seeing this awareness of there's a situation developing on, something has got to be done. And in this same set, I see what I would essentially call is their call to action. In these same notes, it says the great destitution and suffering, as well as the spiritual wants of those people who have been recently released from slavery in our country, has claimed the attention of the committee. And one of the branches informs us that they suggested to their quarterly meeting the propriety of taking measures at an early day to provide more systematically for their temporal wants and for the promotion of missionary labor among them, which suggestion was united with by the meeting, and the subject was referred to the branch committee, with instructions to employ a missionary for this good word at the expense of friends, and a directed sum of money to be raised by subordinate meetings to sustain such labor in the field. So it did take 2 years, but this group is like, all right, we're doing something. And that happens in 1863. And so in 1863, and this is where the Little Rock part of the story keeps coming in. And this is also where I do have this documentation coming from the yearly meeting, but the other sources come from mainly Clara Kennan and Adolphine Terry Fletcher, who are writing in the 1940s, and what I'm getting is their story of Charlotte Stevens, which is a great story, but they're writing it 90 years after it happened, and so details are kind of fuzzy, and I can't tell by going from their story how much of what's actually going on in the school. Getting a concise timeline's been challenging, and if some of it is just, oh, here's the cute story of these people starting a school, or how much this is accurate information to what's actually going on in the classroom. But by 1863, the accounts I've been able to find is the Union Army captures Little Rock in 1863. That is well documented. Also, in 1863, you have a man named William Wallace Andrews, who is the father of Charlotte Stevens, and William Wallace Andrews was a slave to the Ashley family. However, Mrs. Ashley, as just kind of your local lore and story goes, William Wallace was a favored slave to Mrs. Ashley, and she taught him how to read and write, and he has also, if not officially been ordained, but at least since 1854, he's also been permitted to lead a prayer group of what would be Methodists and act kind of as their preacher and the leader. So, according to this lore, the Ashleys are relatively benevolent with at least this part of their people that they hold. And the Ashleys also gave William Wallace land on, some accounts say it's Broadway and 8th, some ways say a state in Maine, or not, someplace around the downtown, gave him land and allowed him to build a church. So starting in 1863, William Wallace is holding a school in Little Rock. And the accounts I've read said there's also a free black man with the Union Army named Gray, and Gray helps him start the school. And I see it in 2 different sources, but I can't find anything primary backing this story up. But that's what is there. And so at some point, and I still can't get the actual date of the arrival of the Society of Friends in Little Rock, but they're definitely taking over the school William Wallace has started. And Charlotte Stevens, or at that time she's known as Lottie Andrews, is also one of the students and a star pupil in this school. And this is where, in my research and my stories, I'm looking at secondary sources here to get what it's like in the school. And it talks about things like using pews for church benches, since it appears to start in the church, using pews for your desks, which makes a lot of sense. And it talks just consistently about lack of supplies. You put your youngest children up front and oldest, which is pretty standard with a one-room schoolhouse. And then there's stories about how the school has no well. And it just leads you to question, which they're all perfectly plausible, but at the same time, it's kind of like they're like, oh, look at the cute little school. It doesn't seem to be treated with the weight that there's actually a school educating freedmen here at that point. And then by 1864, and we're back in 1864 at the Indiana Yearly Meeting looking at these notes, and this is when you really start to get some hard documentary fact on where the Society of Friends is active and what they are doing. So, as I've mentioned before, the Friends take excellent meeting notes. And in 1864, there's definitely things going on at Vicksburg, at Helena, and around. So, and coming from 1864 reports, they said, let's see. It just says, the committee met at the close of our last yearly meeting and organized by appointing a secretary and treasurer and a general receiving agent to see that all goods and clothing contributed to the relief of the freed people were speedily forwarded. At the time of our first meeting, Elkanah Beard informed the committee that he felt concerned to labor among these people in the vicinity of Vicksburg. His wife, Irena Beard, also proposed to accompany and assist her husband in the work. The committee engaged their services, and accompanied by Lizzie Bond, they went directly forward and located Young's Point near Vicksburg. Here they found 250 freedmen in the most wretched and degraded condition. Our friends built a cabin for a dwelling and another for a schoolhouse, in which school was opened by Lizzie Bond, and subsequently 2 more schools were opened in the same vicinity. Their work was not confined to Young's Point. They administered to the necessities of thousands of freedmen at other places along the Mississippi River. And in 1864, you continue to see these reports of there is this person, this is where they are, this is the work they are doing. And something that you don't see in the earlier ones, a lot of the need, yes, the Friends are concerned about education and things for the freedmen, but you also just get the sense of urgency at this point. They are more worried about just keeping the freedmen alive. And in these reports, like, it's the breakdown. This is how many blankets and shoes, and so there's good record tracking, and you see what is being sent. And at this point, those items are probably even more valuable than the education that can be offered. Then when the 1865 reports are starting to come in, this is when you start to see Arkansas being mentioned. And one of the things that I find, one of the other many services that the missionaries that Friends missionaries provided, there was numerous tracts published on the Society of Friends in general, pacifism, their anti-war, and their mission work in general. And it says, and there's just a note that about 3,000 tracts on pacifism were distributed to freedmen, but it says, a few tracts have been distributed by our friends who have been engaged amongst freedmen, but this work has been much restricted on account of inability of the class to read. So you're coming back to that whole education point. And in the same year also being reported, and this is in 1865, so it's more about the efforts of the Friends in 1864 and previous to the state what's going on. They also bring up that the work the missionaries who are coming into the South, it is dangerous for us to do. And it's quoted saying, the danger from raids has prevented our doing anything in Tennessee or inland from the Mississippi or Arkansas rivers. And the rising of the Mississippi put our teachers and superintendents to much inconvenience and stopped their labors in some places. It's also in these meeting notes, so this is definitely referring to work that had happened in 1864 that I found the first mention of missionaries actively being engaged at Little Rock, and it says we have engaged Frank Lamore and wife with Sarah Henley and Martha Thomas to superintend and assist at the orphan asylum at Little Rock. Now, this was the first point that I had heard that there was an orphan asylum here. I knew of the school, so I would love to. That's something I would eventually like to find more on. And then another Arkansas-specific holding or specific location that is up and running and contributing quite a bit is the missionary branch at Helena. And some of you may have heard of this outpost eventually becomes Southland College, which existed into the 1920s. So there has Southland College. It was in Helena, and if you look at the Arkansas Historical Quarterly, Wesley Pierce has written extensively about African American Quakers in Arkansas, and it's the people who attended Southland. But one of the things that I wanted to find out. This is the report coming from Susan Horney, who is the superintendent at Southland in 1864, or it's not Southland yet, but it's the industrial school, it's the orphan asylum, and it's her efforts at Helena. And she says, I began my school without any funds, having 11 overcoats, 2 new ones, and some little shoes left me by another society. One of these coats I soon sold for $5, giving me the first fund, which was soon paid to women to obtain food for their children, who just then had no other way of getting money for labor. After this, I received at different times 8 boxes of overcoats containing from 50 to 53 and 54 in each box. One of these boxes was from Colonel Eaton at Memphis, the other through Elkanah Beard, perhaps from the same. Colonel Eaton also sent me through the superintendent of freedmen $469 worth of new goods, flannels, etc. Some of these I sold to colored people for money, which I paid them for sewing. Others I exchanged for sewing, having some of the goods still on hand made into clothing. The first week of school, 20 garments were made. Second, 20. The third, 112. Fourth, 50. This week, all new garments. Fifth, 89. Sixth, 105. Seventh, 114. Much of the sewing during the last 5 weeks was done at their homes, the women having families of small children who could not stay alone and greatly in need of warm clothes. After this, I confined the sewing generally to my school, making a few exceptions, always trying to get the poorest women whose husbands were in the army or yet in slavery. 518 garments were made during the last 16 weeks, making 1,020 that were manufactured in 23 weeks of our school. 90 of these garments were given to the people in the Freedmen's Fort, 279 in Helena. I furnished the colored hospital in Helena with $79.50 worth of new goods made up into clothing in our school, sheets, pillow slips, and ladies' wrappers. So even at their schools, you're providing an education, but you see these schools, they're making goods. They are just helping these people survive. And let's see, there's something else I wanted to say. And the other notable thing, much like 1863, 1865 is a notable year. You see this relationship between the Indiana Yearly Meeting and the Freedmen's Bureau starting to develop. And as a note, it says General Fisk, Commissioner of Freedmen for Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri, has already intimated his desire that Friends should at once take hold and occupy such fields as they may desire within his jurisdiction, and proffers all aid in his power to advance their work. So by 1866 and 67, the Friends schools and these common schools, much like the school in Little Rock, have been integrated with the Freedmen's Bureau, or if you want to look at it, the Friends are running these institutions on behalf of the Freedmen's Bureau. So by 1868 and getting back to the Union School here at Little Rock, I think at this time it's at 6th and State. So there seems to be some moving around, and there is in the assets, the Society of Friends makes note that they definitely have a building in Little Rock, so I'm suspecting that is the building, the ones at 6th and State. So let me... Right. And this is also, I was going to say, this is an 1867 report saying we had this many students engaged, this is what's going on. And so you're getting back to this. So we know that the Friends definitely has some property in Little Rock by 1867 that a school is being at. At the same time, in Arkansas politics and the whole Reconstruction government, is the act that says that schools and public education shall be provided for black and white children. It said nothing about the schools being equal. It just says that the education shall be provided. And the Friends, through their connection with the Freedmen's Bureau, become essentially, this Union School or a common school becomes the first black public school in Little Rock. At that point, you have this first black public school, and this is where the fun part where the connection of Charlotte Stevens really comes in. She is a student there. She's there in 1868, and by 1869, at 15 years of age, she herself becomes one of the teachers. So as a teenager, she's teaching other ones. I do know later in her story, she gets to go to college in the North. She never actually gets to finish college, but she definitely gets quite a bit of an education. And she goes on to stay teaching in the Little Rock School District up until the 20s. And if you think about it, there's even Stevens Elementary. It's still named there after her. So you have that. And I think that's probably a good point to stop this. I would like to know if you guys have any questions, because I will do my best to answer. If there's anything you'd like to say?
I was in the first grade at Stevens Elementary School in 1950, when I shook hands with Charlotte Stevens.
That's really cool. That was really cool. But thank you so much for attending and listening to me to talk about my new favorite project.